As we enter the fall of what has already been a challenging year, we will face yet more challenges as Election Day approaches. As people of faith, we are called to ask questions about what our community needs from the church in these times. One part of faithful life in a democratic country is to work with elected leaders in our districts at all levels. We must see them as partners and co-workers for the sake of our neighborhoods, no matter what party affiliation they have. With this in mind, I sat down with Katie Valenzuela, City Council member-elect for the 4th District, which is the district our church is in. I was grateful for her openness to sit down and talk about politics, being a woman in leadership, faith, and hope for the future. Welcome to Sacramental Sacramento. So thank you, Katie Valenzuela, for being with us today on the Sacramental Sacramento podcast. So my second, I guess, well, your first official guest for my second episode. So I don't know how to even think about it anymore. And you are our council member elect for this district, which is District 4, right? Mm-hmm, I'm still learning the numbers because I've only been here a year, so I'm trying to get and I live in a slightly different district. I'm just in off on 21st and Broadway by the Pancake Circus. So, so thanks for being here. So I want to talk today. This podcast is about, how is God at work in the world in all sorts of different ways and in all sorts of people doing good work on behalf of our neighbors and our community and justice in the world. And so I want to hear a little bit more about who you are as a person and what you're passionate about. And then some of your, obviously as a newly elected and soon to start public official, what is that like? And I know you're doing environmental justice work now, and so we can talk a little bit about that too. But why don't you just introduce yourself however you would like, whether it's about your family, where you come from, what's important to you. Who are you, Katie Valenzuela?
That's a good segue. I am really excited to be here, and especially to be outdoors in the presence of actual people. That's
right.
I know, a lovely treat.
Unique
because most of the time I'm just staring at screens and searching for contact. But yeah, I'm an organizer. I'm an advocate. That's how I was raised. I was raised by a dad who really was involved in helping youth in the community and wanted me to be involved. And I came to Davis and figured out I could do that for a living by studying community development, which still seems super surreal that I get paid to do what I do on a daily basis. Because I was born and raised in Oildale in Kern County, an unincorporated town in the Central Valley. And, my dad always said to say that because I used to say Kern County, or sometimes I'd say Bakersfield because no one knew where Oildale was. And he's like, no, you need to say you're from Oildale. People need to know that people do things in Oildale.
Right.
Go off
people are actually from here.
Yeah. We're a place, you need to say it. So I always say it. But, now when I look at what I'm doing today in terms of serving in Sacramento and what I do in my day job with environmental justice, it feels very full circle for me and very surreal that this is what I get to do for my life. But that's who I am. It's and especially in this pandemic, since I live by myself with my 2 dogs that I talk about with they're people. One of my neighbors the other day said, oh, did you get a roommate? And I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, you keep saying we pronouns, and so I thought someone was living with you. Now I'm like, oh no, I'm talking about my dogs.
Oh yes. And as a dog owner,
we are going to go get dinner now.
Yes, exactly.
We are going on a walk.
Now, do they have unique voices?
Just a little bit. Yeah, in my head they do for sure. So yeah, it's this is all I do, which I'm just so grateful to have that outlet and that opportunity and this time between the election when I get sworn in to really get to know people and get immersed in the work in a different way.
Yeah. So what things are you passionate about? You shared a little about your dad and why you wanted to be involved from a very young age, or that was part of your growing up culture. But what things are you passionate about, and why did you run for public office?
Yeah. My dad always told me that if we see something wrong, we have a responsibility to do something about it if we can, that if we see something wrong and we don't do something about it, that we're part of the problem. And so I have always had this really deep conviction in me that when I see something wrong, I want to do something about it. And I think especially with all the crises, like the multiple crises going on, it's so easy to normalize what we're seeing around us. And I always talk about this moment I had with an unhoused man when I was really tired. I had just flown back from the East Coast. I was like warped. I was just going to go pick up some food and go home. And this gentleman came in. He was a Black gentleman. He looked like he was probably in his 70s. He had his few bucks that he had gotten that day, and he was just looking for some steamed rice and veggies. And the staff was so great to him, right? Like, you sat down, they gave him some warm water, and he was having this meal, and you could just see this relief, that this was this one moment of just comfort that he was going to have before he went back out and tried to find a place to sleep. And I went out in my car and I sobbed. And it wasn't the first time I had seen someone who fit this description or was having this moment. But, when you look around what's happening, it's not okay that people don't have safety, that they don't have comfort, that we aren't taking care of people in our community. And that really hit a crisis point for me in 2018. And I had some personal experiences go on. And I finally said, you know what, if I'm going to do I can do something about this. And so harken back to my dad's energy and said let's go, let's do this, and that's what I'm passionate about is, not just helping the community, but, when he first got me involved when I was 13, they were talking about starting this big youth event that they wanted to do every year. And to him, it just didn't make sense that they were talking about youth and there weren't any youth in the room. Like, it was just a very basic equation. Like, well, they're talking about kids and there's no kids in the room. So I told them you'd come next week. And so then I became a part of this effort that I stayed a part of. But that's also a core tenet for me is lifting up those voices of folks who are impacted and letting them be a part of that decision and a part of that change. Table, So those are sort of my main guiding principles, and it's led me across a whole spectrum of work from education advocacy to environmental advocacy to urban farming to all sorts of things.
Housing issues.
Housing issues with the land trust, and even now with fighting, with oil companies. I like to say I argue with oil companies for a living, and people chuckle, and I'm like, oh, really? It's all about bringing in those voices and lifting up community experience to try to get a better solution.
Yeah. This, obviously we're a faith community at St. John's. And so this podcast tries to look at, if there is a faith component to your work, we like to ask that question. If not, that's okay too. But do you connect this at all to either faith or spirituality in some sense, or and however that you would define that? Maybe you want to define your spirituality first. But do you connect it at all to that, or?
Yeah, for me, definitely. It doesn't fit into a super good box, and maybe I'll describe it and someone will tell me this is the box you're in.
Right,
but,
maybe.
I've always believed in God, and I don't believe in coincidences. I believe that I am where I am for a reason, that things happen for reasons. And, that I have this larger feeling of responsibility for the community around me. It just never really fit squarely into any of the boxes. And I tried, I went to Methodist churches and Nazarene churches when I was young. And every once in a while, my, mom would get into a tough time and suddenly we'd be at Sunday school the next week because she was trying to find answers for herself. But, it's always, for me, it comes back to that greater sense of purpose. It's a huge part of my life. I don't talk about it a ton because people always want to put it into a box, and I'm I'm very open to how I feel. I've studied the Bible. I've studied other, religious books. It's just, I don't know. maybe you can tell me what box I fit into. Spiritual, but not religious. It just feels so squishy, It's just I don't know.
Yeah.
I've been baptized. I'm just
well, so then, you can fit into the Christian box, but it doesn't have to be a confining box. But I think that's why I wondered about spirituality, because it is squishy, right? Sometimes it's hard to pin down, but that moment, that anecdote you just shared, or that story you shared about the man getting a meal, right? That's in religious or in language that I might use, I'd say that was a moment of grace, right? Or of mercy, or and it. Like you said, it happens all the time in a sense. Sometimes we get very cynical that no good happens, right? But human beings have the capacity for good, and I think even in our connections with one another, that's a spiritual experience, right? And so thank you for kind of sharing that. And it doesn't have to fit in a box, and I think that's why I love talking with people and kind of seeing whether or not they know it, God is at work in them. And And sometimes you can bless someone by kind of pointing that out, or, or just kind of like acknowledging it in a different way. And so what do you love about Sacramento? Because this is a chosen home now, right? And does it feel like home to you? And,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, your home is always your home.
Right.
Like, you go back to Bakersfield for me and Oildale where my family is, and there's something always special about that place for me. But Sacramento, I remember, and I didn't even immediately move to Sacramento. I moved to Davis, and I was just blown away with the diversity because, I grew up, Bakersfield and Kern County is still very segregated. And, I lived in a very white part of town, where I grew up in Oildale was predominantly white, very low class, very lower class, low wages. I was one of very few kids of color in any of my schools growing up. And I went to Davis and was like, oh my goodness, who are all these people? And what is this background? You stumbled a little bit at first just learning, because I wasn't raised around that, but I learned to just love it. And now being in Sacramento, we just launched a survey the other night that we can talk about, but it was so great because, we have folks who are translating it into Russian. We have folks who are translating it into Vietnamese. We have folks who are reaching out to Hmong Innovating Politics to get outreach to make sure their folks can take it. And how do we get into the community on that? And I was just I love that about this town. And I love that it's this, it's a town of activist neighborhoods, and that's the other energy I like. I don't always agree with what folks are doing, but I love how engaged everybody is here, and they're all watching the city and they're watching the state, and it just gives you this energy of we're not just a government town, we're the state capital, and every once in a while you feel that current, and it's electrifying in its own way.
What is the survey so you said there's a survey that you put out?
Yeah, we did People's Budget Sacramento. We were inspired by People's Budget Los Angeles, which was led by Black Lives Matter LA, and they put out a survey and used that to form a budget proposal. It took them several months that they have now pretty much successfully been lobbying for at the city of LA to move funding into human services and social services and housing and things that the community needed. So we got a lot of inspiration from that and decided to launch the same survey. And so we have this really cool tool, and it's peoplesbudgetsac.com, I think is the URL. And we have it in multiple languages. It's native Spanish translated, and we're working on others so that folks can tell us their priorities and get involved. And it's an exciting mechanism, I hope, to help people feel like they're being heard and that they have an avenue to make change in their community.
That sounds great. Yeah. I know just doing this work as the pastor here, doing outreach for a year, it's and it was true when I was in New York too, trying to also do some work with unhoused folks. It was there's parallels and there's differences, of course, right? But it was always what resources does this person need, and how do I begin to find it? If I come across someone that is in need, or if they come to me here at the church, it's sometimes I just don't even know who to point them to. And sometimes you get a runaround. It's well, call this person and they'll help you. And then it just gets circled back to the same person. It's well, I already called that person. And, or the navigators that we have in the city to help unhoused folks deal with every single issue. And it's well, that person can only deal with so much. And we already talked to her. And now you've sent this person who has mental health issues, back just to the navigator. That's the only answer we have. And so we really do need these really human resource services out on the street.
Absolutely.
And I know, are you involved with the CARES Act funding, stuff like that? And I saw an article today about, where that's being spent and some of the troubling things with that. And
it's all based on that same principle of the money that it all comes from us, we're all this is our money, and it should be going where we need it. And especially since the pandemic hit, I did a survey for the city, and then some counterparts of mine that work more in the county had replicated it and done a similar survey for the county. And we found overwhelmingly the number one thing was rent mortgage assistance, overwhelmingly. And then shortly thereafter, you'd get to services for unhoused, where folks are going to camp, where are we going to put, how are they going to go to the bathroom, where's food, where's water, how do we make sure folks are okay? day. And then you started getting to like, subsequent needs of like, we need to start creating jobs. We need some food, we need a whole range of things. And so, when the county, so the city got 89 million, the county got 181 million. And the article that came out yesterday said that of the 150 they've spent so far, over 100 million went to the sheriff.
Right.
And actually another chunk of it, the second tier went to like probation, I believe, and like correctional officers in the jails. And then like literally like 2%, less than 2% went to public health in the middle of a pandemic. And so it was really frustrating to see that misalignment and like what the community was saying they needed and what just like common sense would dictate, more of this money should have been going to public health for contact tracing, for, masks, for like you name it, so that people would be safe out in the community. And instead we sent it to an agency that is arguably not serving us very well in this pandemic. So it was super frustrating, and it does all circle back. So in the People's Budget Sacramento space, like we've been working together to try to strategize around that money as well, because it comes back to that same principle of like it should be going where it's going to be most help.
Right. And to really listen again, like, it goes back to one of your foundational things, right? Like bring the people to the table or hear the voices of those who actually like,
Absolutely.
we want to help. We say we want to help those most in need, but then we don't really listen to what they're saying. And it's one of the things here at church too, we try to do like social outreach and things. And sometimes we make assumptions about what's most needed. And, because it's, I don't know, scary sometimes to reach out and talk to people, or it seems like a lot of work, or it's like, so we just say, well, we'll just provide this and that's enough. But I think like God definitely calls us to a more like abundant, like we want to offer people abundant life, not just like crumbs or like little help, or just assume that this is what they need and it's not at all what they've been asking for. And so,
and I think it, and even just best practice, right? Because I mean, if you take just the humanity and kindness out of trying to meet people's needs, like that's a whole, that should be our guiding principle, but it's not. If we just looked though at, not for everybody, right? And so if we look just at cost effectiveness, and we have community members right now who haven't paid rent for potentially up to 5 months, we're on the verge of a massive eviction crisis, in addition to the growing needs of folks who are sleeping on the streets and in cars and on couches. And, just from a cost effectiveness perspective, it's like dealing with it now is not only kinder and more humane, it actually saves us money.
Right,
and that's part of what People's Budget was trying to do. We have a whole learn section about how our current approach of sticks, of just like getting people when they do something wrong isn't only not kind, is disproportionately hurting people of color and Black and brown people. It's, it's also wasting money and not actually helping address the issue we all say we want to address.
Right.
Trying to bring some of that back into the conversation has been, it's frustrating how difficult it is, but I'm hopeful that there's a lot of folks who are asking these questions now after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and just all of these really unfortunate incidences over the last few months, that I'm hopeful that in Sacramento, I always like to joke that I'm like, if any city can do it, Sacramento can do it. Like, we're the right size city. We have the right size budget. We've got all these different folks who have all these different experiences in state government and federal government. Like, we should be able to do this here and figure it out.
Well, you sound like you have a lot of hope about that. So
I definitely do. And somebody asked me, like, why are you so optimistic? And I'm like, well, what's the alternative?
Right,
like,
right.
The alternative is that I sit in my apartment and stare at the wall and lament about the ills of the world.
And talk to your dogs.
Or talk to my dogs, my people
sure
friends,
listen,
my little fur friends. Yeah. But, or, to believe that it's possible. I completely have hope. I think we're capable of really amazing things in Sacramento.
Yeah. What do you think, one of the things that, when I was in Brooklyn, this was true of the neighborhoods there, and it's true now of Sacramento. Although it's interesting, the pandemic might shift this too, but this gentrifying, especially in Midtown in your district, right? Mm-hmm. And it's happening in Oak Park and different areas around here. And it is a mixed bag of blessing, like, hey, I like a nice coffee shop as much as anyone. But, then people being pushed out of places where they've lived forever, or they just can't afford to live in their hometown anymore or in their neighborhood. And all the things that go along with that, including increased rents. And now, again, like you're saying, we have a risk that we're going to make more people homeless or unhoused just because they can't afford their rent because their business closed, or, there's all these different things, but how do you look at gentrification and what, as you move into becoming the city council member, like what do you think about gentrification? How I don't know what policies you have related to that or what ideas you have as you think about that and the blessings, but also the challenges that it brings and really the detriment that it can be to the people that have lived there for a long time.
Yeah, I am very passionate about this. Having spent several years organizing in Oak Park and a couple years living there before I also had to leave. It was something to watch. It's heartbreaking to watch when it's happening because I remember once walking up to a neighbor's door when I first moved to Oak Park. His name was Lucky. He was this like older man sat on his porch, and I said something about like the new trees they were planting along Broadway or something. I forget what I had mentioned, and he's like, "Oh no, honey, those aren't for us." And I just looked at him like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "No, those are for the folks that are going to live here. You wait and see." And this is someone who's not on Facebook. He's not a very political person. But sure enough, a year later, he had lost his house at an auction. And, 2 years later, I was gone. And, he just they feel that it's as much a physical displacement issue as it is a cultural displacement issue. And it really comes down to who's making those decisions. Because it starts with lack of investment. We created these areas of town just by isolating them either through redlining or something else. And This is where people of color were able to go. This is where you were able to buy houses or rent a house and build your family and go to school and do what you needed to do. And, the interest of investing there, for some, I think it comes from a good place, and from others, I think it's because there's an opportunity, and they see an opportunity to flip that house and make six figures, or they see an opportunity to bring in a brewery and make a ton of money. But a lot
of times there's incentives again,
exactly,
with city policies or county policies,
and they kind of reinforce this process. But it's done without intention, and it's done without the people who live there really being the ones who are steering that direction and that investment. And we just saw an unfortunate example here in Midtown, right, where you had a Black-run company coming in to run the farmers market who was told as soon as it was successful to pass the reins to somebody else and we're going to take it over from you. And, talking to that business owner, he was so frustrated because he's like, we finally, I feel like every time we build something, I'm paraphrasing here, that, that is successful, someone comes in and takes it from us. So it's both about who gets to decide and who shares in that benefit. And how are we intentional about ensuring that we're protecting the housing around these sites, that we're protecting the homeowners who maybe can't maintain their home and are now looking at selling because that's really the only thing they can afford to do. So there's so many layers into that I feel so strongly about, and watching it happen again and again, it is heartbreaking because something that frustrates me is when local decision makers will say, well, what are we going to do about it? We can't. And I'm like, we absolutely, this is just as government created as it is government run at this point. And we could absolutely do something about this if we were willing to sit back and have that conversation.
Yeah, that's what in Brooklyn, it was so easy to be hopeless. Okay, there's no way we can possibly run up against, this large machine that, is either government or the market, because developers want to make money and stuff. And so it always felt like, how do you even begin to do that work? And so I know as an organizer, you begin with the people, right? And so what does that look like? How do you get people together on an issue? And can you maybe give an example? I know you probably have a number of examples, but one that sticks out to you as a success or wow. And even if it didn't maybe achieve the final goal, but moved it a little. I know, again, when in the last podcast episode talking to Jim Ketty, it wasn't quite what they wanted, but then it moved, though sort of the agenda then had to shift of, those in power, because it was enough people are interested in this issue that we have to work for justice for children and, and youth. And so I don't know if you have examples that you'd like to share about how people working together can actually affect change. And
absolutely. I think for me, the first step is always to help folks see what's possible. Because, we always talk about how you only know what you know, right? And if all you know is strip malls or certain types of development, you don't think to ask for the multi-use whatever thing because you've never seen that. You don't know it exists. And so I always think an important job of any organizer is to help folks learn about what's been done in other cities, about what's been accomplished in other places. And so here with the land trust, for example, we started a community land trust, which is one of the tools. And we're the tip of the spear. Part of the anti-gentrification fight is just taking parcels out of the market and just putting them into community stewardship so that they can't be subject to that speculation and, highs and lows of the market. And it preserves affordability just very naturally by I'm not just going to sell it to whoever's the highest bidder. Is you're going to sell it and I'm going to sell it to the next person in line behind you. And the savings pass forward. But, when we had some of our early meetings, a lot of folks were kind of is this really possible? Like, what are you getting this together for? And so we showed them case study after case study, and we had photos and we had videos from other communities, as close as Oakland, as far away as the South, of times when people have done this. The oldest land trust actually is this organization called New Communities, and it's a group of folks who are descendants of slaves in the South who pull together their resources to buy essentially an old plantation and turn it into a farm and living space and educational center for their community. And it's a beautiful story. I mean, they went through it with the federal government and they lost the land at one point and had to sue, but then they won. And in the end, they have this great legacy now for their community. And, you see that video and everybody in the room is just like, we could do that. Like, I mean, all of a sudden you could almost feel the energy shift in the room of just like, oh, that's possible. And like, we had this movie night once, and we had someone from Oakland Land Trust here, and he's like, yes, it's possible. Let me talk to you about the 20 other communities who've done just that. And what we're doing an hour and a half away from you to try to preserve housing right there. And so I think you have to give people hope that change is possible. And so like, even in my day job with environmental justice, there's always this element of cross learning. You're working with organizing groups all over the state that are heavily impacted. And sometimes, learning from each other and what they've been able to do really helps inspire them for ideas, or even just help bolster and support each other. And this broader sense of community, it's not your community's fault this is happening or not happening. And you can do something about it. This is a larger systems issue, but there's something that can be done.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is really, one person obviously can't maybe afford to buy like a piece of land, right? But like if you band together and pool resources and find out what else is possible, and I just like how you describe, it is eye opening, right? Like, wow, like, and it brings people that like glimmer of hope that people working together can actually do something really big.
And here in Sacramento, I mean, we've had our stories, and like they're not often told, but we've had a neighborhood in South Sacramento was about to have a bunch of natural gas pumped under their homes by this large gas company that had millions. I mean, they were a well-off company. They already had their permits from SMUD, and they appealed all the way to the State Public Utilities Commission and won, using like in partnership with legal aid attorneys. I mean, like there's stories like that all over this community of neighborhoods getting together, of faith leaders. You think about like there was a group of pastors and who got together and started purchasing land because they're like, we're going to stop waiting on the city to provide affordable housing, and we'll just start doing it for ourselves. And I mean, all of those efforts, the Sacramento Valley Organizing Project, sorry, I had to remember what they were called. I was like, this is like slipping my mind, but there's like, we have it here in our community, and I think learning from each other and being bolstered by that success, even if it's not here, is really important, for folks to create a vision that's truly free and what they want.
Yeah. Now, we share something in common as women leaders in, previously or like traditionally male-dominated and maybe still male-dominated fields. And I know you just had a town hall on Friday about women in leadership with some other women leaders and all women of color, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe you can share a little about that. I also know you had a not so great experience of, I assume, a white male colleague. I didn't know his background in particular, but I saw your post on Facebook about that. And maybe you can talk about some of those challenges and again, hopes, like as a woman in leadership, like where do women bring gifts to that, and where women's voice is really important. And
absolutely. Yeah. We've, unfortunately, what happened to me last week, it wasn't the first time it's happened. It just was such a public, shameful time when a Senator Hertzberg, we were there to testify on an oil bill. I was the lead witness, and we had a resident from Coalinga. It was his first time ever testifying. He was so nervous. It was so sweet. He practiced all weekend and multiple versions of his testimony. We practiced Monday for an hour. Like, he was ready and dialed in, right, and excited to participate. And the senator didn't want to vote on the bill, but he'd been getting so much heat, well-organized heat, because we had a good coalition going and like trying to put pressure to get him to support the bill, that instead of talking about the merits of the bill, he came after us personally and named us, which is very unusual on the Senate floor, to have people call you out by name, but in a way that basically insinuated that we didn't know what we were talking about, that we were misleading people intentionally, that we didn't understand the law. And it was, I'm grazing over it a little bit because I obviously have a lot more feelings underneath the surface and different words I could use, but it was really unacceptable and too indicative.
It wouldn't have been done presumably to a man or
it was too common, and it was frustrating that after it happened, the number of people who reached out to me who'd had altercations with this specific senator, people who were just blown away, or like, I've worked in the legislature for 30 years and I've never seen someone come after an advocate like that. Like, that's not okay. So we got organized. And I mean, the thankful thing of women that I know and love is just how resilient we are. We don't give up, we withstand. And immediately, I mean, within an hour of that hearing ending, I had, dozens of women reaching out to me, offering support, saying they'd been there, want to help draft letters, to Rules Committee, want to help me think through next steps and strategy. And it was incredible to automatically just feel this like bringing in of all this like women army around me. They're like, we've got you. This was not okay. Like, we're going to figure this out. And I was just talking to one when I was walking over here, actually from a statewide organization, where she's like, no, we're going to organize a letter. Like, we're going to do this. And I was like, thank you so much. So it's unfortunate. And it was interesting. A reporter asked me, he framed the question in such an interesting way, because he's like, well, some people say this sort of intimidation is normal, but like, or it's just like, this is how it is. But like, maybe it's a result of the fact that it is how it is because men have always been the ones who are there. And I was like, exactly. And this is how our systems work, right? We think of systems as these amorphous, non-personal things, but systems are built by people. And if you have a specific group of people who are controlling those systems, it tends to bias the way a certain group of people see the world and the way they work. And that sort of hostility shouldn't be okay. And, I mean,
and it doesn't have to be like, well, that's just how it is, right?
Yeah, and that's what someone said, oh, this happens. And I'm like, of course it happens. And this isn't about me not being able to handle it, because I've been handling it for the decade that I've been here. This is about me saying I'm not going to tolerate it anymore, and that we shouldn't tolerate this. So yeah, that's why I believe representation is just so critical in government at all levels, because that's what it's going to take to change this, is to have different people. And the fact that I had women senators reaching out to me saying, we've got your back, what do you want to do? It helps you take action that you wouldn't be able to take if it was all male senators. So it's, it's unfortunate that it's there. But again, I have a lot of hope. What I think women bring to this in terms of our collaborative nature, just in terms, again, of our resiliency and creativity and just that passion we have. I remember seeing this sign after George Floyd was killed, and people were really upset about like the conduct of the protesters. And I thought it was so interesting because, of course, property damage isn't good. It's not okay. But what was fascinating, I saw this picture of this woman, a pregnant woman, at a protest, and her sign was basically like, if my son had been killed, walking to the store to get some Skittles, or, and her last sentence was, if my son had called out my name as somebody was killing him, like, I would be breaking windows too, and it was just like, let's put this in context, right, of what people are feeling. And I just thought that was such a powerful perspective. And yeah, don't underestimate the fight of anybody who's caring for someone they love, but also, women have that special spark.
Yeah, and I think, you talked about with issues of race as well as gender and identity. I think there's a shift now in the dialogue in the public, in the public sphere, and so I am hopeful that something's really will change this time. I think we've made micro change, it is moving in a right direction. It has been, but then when you hear about yet another death of a Black person, at the hands of law enforcement or a white, the dominant white culture, you're like, okay, like, when will it really just change, And,
well, we had it here in Sacramento, right? I mean, Jeremy Southern was killed just a few weeks ago. And I remember talking to some folks in his family, and the system failed him. Like, maybe that shooting was justified, whatever that means. But I mean, when you hear his story about foster care and looking for love, and there was this video he had posted on Facebook that, he had found out, I guess, that his family didn't really love him, or they just adopted him for the money or something like that. And it was this really powerful video where he told his story about the index cards, but he ended it on, he had finally found a family who did love him, and he had this hope, and he was offering to be a listener to anybody going through this. And it was just, when you think about how we just completely drove that poor man to where he ended up, it breaks your heart. And it makes you wonder if we can really change, but we have to. Yeah.
So I have to preach this week. So, with 3 pastors. So I was used to preaching every week, but now it's nice. I get to take breaks and share the responsibility with my colleagues. But so in my mind is the story that I have to preach on this week. And this conversation is somewhat helpful too, and thinking about, okay, well, what's important about the story. But the story is, and maybe you know this one, but the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman, and she comes to Jesus. He crosses a boundary into a non-Jewish area, possibly because he wants to get away from crowds that might want to seek out help because he's just kind of worn out, But here's this woman who comes and seeks justice for her daughter or healing for her daughter. And Jesus' response is not quite what we expect from Jesus. He kind of, he sort of uses, I don't know if it's a slur, but he says, well, it's not right to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs when she asks for help. But she persists. She doesn't take that. She kind of turns it around. And she says, yeah, okay, but, even the dogs eat the crumbs, right? And, and to me, it speaks so much of this time that we're in this question about how do we respond in faith, right? Do we want people just to get the crumbs or have to beg for the crumbs, or do we want to create the picture of God's kingdom, which is abundant life for everyone, or hope that belongs to everyone? And but I was thinking about especially as we're coming up to an election time, and I know it's something I don't know if worry is the word, but we are aware at St. John's that it will be an emotional time for our people because we have people of different views, politically and, different backgrounds. And so we try to be attentive to that without shying away from the message of justice or what we think God's justice means and what we have to preach, and not everyone agrees on that. And so we sometimes hear that, but I know it's a little bit of a different position, but as a public official too, you're going to be taking office in a time when we've been polarized as a country. So how do you see, Jesus? So Jesus crossed these boundaries, and so in some sense, we don't want to be a church that says, well, we're only for conservatives, or we're only for liberals, or we're only for this kind of person, right? We value multiple voices that can challenge one another and make us each think, okay, my way is not the right way, and how do I temper that? But how do you see that in your work in the public sphere, especially as you have constituents that may not, of course, agree with your views and you might not agree with theirs, but how do you then, as we try to minister to a wide group of people, how do you serve a wide group of people? Is there any advice for us as, as a faith community, but just a group of people trying to live, in Sacramento and in the world? In
the world in general, right? It's all gotten so polarized. And yeah, you have to serve everybody, and that's my job, and I pride myself on trying to call everybody back. Even if I get a yelly voicemail, I'll call it, or an angry voicemail or an email, I do my best to respond. I think I may have missed a couple over the months, but it's always interesting because I was just explaining this as a student the other day. I was talking to the Chicano Youth Leadership Program had a forum, and I was speaking to these students, and somebody asked me this question, well, how do you interact with folks who just think that, all unhoused folks should go to jail and, they all don't want help or whatever. And I say, I always start with listening because we all live in the same world and we have the same experiences, but there's something that person has experienced that they're interpreting differently than I would. And so I'm trying to figure out, what is that core experience that they had that made them think right this way, and what are they looking at that makes them think this is a solution? And I've learned a lot actually about Seattle is Dying is one of those documentaries, right? People kept talking about it, and so I finally watched it, and I was like, my goodness, if I had seen this documentary, I would believe that we should arrest everybody too, because it's all about how the cops can't do anything but look at these programs that are really helping people when they go to jail, and why aren't we letting them help people by taking them to jail? And I was like, it's just these light bulbs go off where you read these blogs, or someone will finally send me a link to something, and I'll look at it and be like, okay, if this is what I was seeing, then yeah, that would be my conclusion. And so then I'm like, now I can better understand how to relate to that person and how to help crosswalk over. I talked about Seattle is Dying. I said, that is one model that may be effective for some people, but we could help so many more people if we do something outside of the prison system, and maybe then they don't have the record and the other burdens that come with having been incarcerated to help them get a job. And we have all this research about how that helps them. And people go, oh, you don't think about that, but you have to listen, because I think we forget that we're all seeing similar things. And some of the folks who are like, you can't defund the police, when you really ask folks questions, they don't know about what works. I had this one woman who was, cited the youth gun violence has been happening in the South area recently, unfortunately. And she's like, well, this isn't a good time to defund police. And I'm like, but if we could put that money to people who can intervene and stop that gun from being fired, isn't that better than having police respond when it fires? And it was so interesting because immediately the tone shifted in this post, and she's like, does that work? And asked the question. I'm like,
yeah.
Woo, like we got an opening here for me to be able to relate to what the other studies that you may not have seen are showing, and really use this as a moment where you understand that I'm hearing you. But if I don't convince you that I'm hearing you, then now we're just going to keep arguing with each other. Right. And we can't actually have that conversation where we broaden each other's perspective and come to a conclusion that makes sense for both of us. I've talked to people who, I remember talking to this older man, canvassing in Southland Park, who's had a violent home invasion, and they had come in, they laid on top of his mom, who was 90 years old, to keep her quiet, came in, took everything, left. They called the cops. Nobody came for hours. And he's like, what do you mean you defund the police? Like, they're not, we need the more police. And so now when I understand that experience, it's like, okay, now we're talking about freeing up officers or emergency responders time so that they can respond when something's happening, and they're not over here doing something that they're not trained to do and they shouldn't be doing in the first place. But I saw,
isn't that one of your priorities, right?
Exactly.
Like, to do it in the
Exactly.
right way, in the most effective ways.
Yeah, I love this. There's this image of this police officer with this huge, this wagon, and he's got all these boulders behind him. And it's like mental illness, drug abuse, domestic violence, blah, blah, blah. And everyone's like, defund the police. How on earth do you expect him to carry all of that? And then the next picture shows all the rocks being rolled off to housing services, alcohol service, this and that. They're like, he's not supposed to be carrying all of that.
Right. They don't want to.
Yeah, they don't want to. And that's not how the system was built. That's not what they were trained for. And, we think about what we need emergency responders for, and really narrowing that lens and freeing up resources to respond to the other things. But you can't convince somebody of that until they feel like they've been heard and they know that you're communicating them from a place of common understanding. I hear what you're saying. That was an awful experience. I'm sorry that happened. And this is part of what I want to do this, is because I want to free up resources so you have someone who can respond when something that is obviously an emergency happens in your home. Right. And so, it's a lot of listening and a lot of patience and just trying to recognize our common humanity and our common experience. We both see the same person sitting on the sidewalk, but we're seeing different things and trying to understand.
We're making assumptions about why are they sitting there?
Exactly.
And I think, like with defund the police or Black Lives Matter, people hear the soundbite and they then don't dig beneath and stay curious or ask what does it actually mean? What are you actually talking about? Because I think we're in a society where we have to have the sort of the soundbite or the little piece that goes on, and it fits well in an advertising. We're in advertising visual culture, so it's you need to see that to catch people's attention. But then, that shouldn't be the last piece, right? It's then we need to ask, so what do you actually mean by that? Or tell me your story. Like you're saying, if you actually ask someone, well, why do you think that? What makes you believe what you believe? And help me to understand where you're coming from. Then you're actually asking, who are you as a person? Not just, oh, this thing you posted on Facebook, that's who you are, or that your opinion is who you are. It's well, no, it's really what helped you come to that opinion. I want to know more and realize, we're all in the same world. We all, and this is one of the things as a Christian value, and one person who's more valuable than another, no matter what their circumstances, right? Absolutely. Now that doesn't always bear out. And that's where justice, I think, comes in, right? If systems are not actually making that a reality or living that reality or that truth, then that's where I think people of faith or, people who care should step in and say these people are not, certain people are not being valued the same, or at least not being given the same access to the things of life. And we're all a result of our own experiences and what we read and what we see. I mean, my mom is a total Democrat in Kern County. And I remember when the pandemic started, I was, lecturing her, as a lot of us millennials had to do with our parents, about wearing masks when she went outside, which, thankfully she started doing. But at first she's like, oh, isn't this just a Democrat Republican thing? Because she lives in Kern County, and all the media down there, which is very conservative, what she kept hearing was, this is just a political thing. It's this and that. And so you really have to appreciate that we all come with a perspective that's based off of lived experiences and things we read. And especially when you learn about search engines and how they're sort of trying to pre-filter what you see when you search for things based on what you've read before. Right. I mean, we really get into this weird
sort of rut with what we see, sort of ratifying what we think, it's hard to sometimes break out of that and look at something new. But I always start with the question to folks of, is what's happening right now working in your mind? And, most, like, nobody says yes. Everyone's like, no. Right. I'm like, okay, so like, let's try to unearth what that is. And I don't believe anybody's born with bias or hate. I think that it's learned, and so how do we help people unlearn and maybe think about things a little differently?
Yeah. And we're trying to get away from an understanding here. We have a racial justice ministry, and so we're trying to continue to have conversations and help, our church to do self-reflection and wrestle with our own history and present moments of, where we are involved with, racist policies, or, what does my privilege mean, and how do I act faithfully out of that? But we're trying to use language of like, you're not a bad or a good person. Like, it's these systems that we're caught in, or it's this like, culture that we are a part of. So it's not that you're a bad person.
Yeah.
And so, because I think, people feel so like shamed, or, or they feel like, yeah, you're saying my politics are bad, or like, or I'm a bad person if I think this. And it's like, no, it's not about that. It's about, it's about just trying to, I don't even know what it's about, but it's about just not labeling people like as good or bad. But I mean, we're all flawed, trying to do the best we can. And, we have to be willing to listen to one another, to make things better.
And be willing to act. And I think it's like, once you understand, what do you do with that? And it's not about being shameful and just stepping back and disengaging. But I mean, you did hit on, and I didn't cover this when you asked me at first, because I wasn't sure if I should. But I mean, it's a big part of the reason that I'm not religious is because of the history of the church with my community as a Native community. What the church has done, through colonization and a whole range of really, it's a painful history that persists to this day for a lot of communities. And it's hard, to feel like you're really a part of that, even when you desperately want to be. And I struggled a lot with that when I was younger, and then finally decided that, I felt sure enough in my own footing and felt free enough outside that maybe I would just do what I do in the community on the outside, but it is, it's not... So there's always that question of like, well, do we just give up on the institution? I have a lot of friends who've given up on institutions like the church, or do you try to make it better?
Yeah.
And, definitely appreciate everybody within, especially within the church family, who's asking these questions, because it's important. It's too important for us to just let go of.
Yeah. Well, so 2 final questions. So what do you think faith communities can do to make an impact, or even to support your work? Because that's something that at St. John's we'd want to know, what we could be a part of or what we could do. And then you kind of already touched on this, but maybe just as like a last nugget, what gives you hope?
I think what you all can do is, I mean, not only to keep having these conversations within your church, but to think about how do we bring these conversations out into your neighborhoods and into your networks, because there are places that someone like me can't reach because I am a polarizing politician, as much as I just think I'm doing what I think is right.
You're just Katie, right?
I'm just me. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm just talking about defunding the police. What's the big deal? There's certain people who are just like, no, shut down. That folks in the church, that may have relationships with, and we need to keep having. I was just telling someone that I'm like, like you have friends that I don't share, and like, how can we start having these conversations and seeing that grow outside of the church? So it makes it easier for us to push for these changes when they need to happen, because when we see something going on, it needs to be a chorus of voices that's beyond our own. Like the People's Budget, we pushed out the survey, but we all really much, as much as our group is this big, beautiful coalition of like more than 30 organizers are on these calls of all different genders and races and backgrounds, and it's such a beautiful group. There's this moment where we're like, we're going to need help getting this out to people, because our networks are only going to go so far, and we want to get to the folks who aren't in our networks and really hear what they have to say. So that's where I think a lot of help in just spreading this message and this conversation as far as we can, because we need to not give up on any of these folks in our communities that we think we need to give up on, because everybody, even in the last few months, watching some of my maybe Trump-ish leaning folks in my life start to slowly merge over and say, hey, what about this Bernie Sanders guy or whatever. So my brother was like a Trump guy. long story. And like right before the election, he said that he really liked Bernie and wanted to go get a shirt before like the primary was done. And I was like, what? Like, I mean, not because yes, I was a Bernie person, but also because I was just so impressed that he had made such a shift. And,
yeah, it's hard for people to shift.
Yeah, he's in a bubble. He lives in Alabama. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of exposure, but he sent me this race podcast he was listening to about confronting race with like Matt Damon or whoever was on it. I think Matthew McConaughey, one of those guys. But I was so proud of him for taking those steps. So growth is possible, even in the most unlikely of circumstance. And that's what gives me hope. I think, we're not born into one mold of who we're going to be. We change over time, and I believe a lot of change is capable individually within people and as a community, because we are people. In the end, I love when people talk about the economy. I always get frustrated when they talk about the economy as this amorphous thing of like, no, it's people. It's people who buy things. It's people who make things. It's people who sell things. Like it's all of us. We do make up this fabric, and as hard as these systems are to change, we built them so we can change them. So that's what gives me hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. And I know we've only touched the tip of the iceberg on a number of things. So I look forward to hearing more from you. And obviously as our council member, I hope that we can be partners and, have people in the church maybe sit down with you sometime and, learn more about how we can get involved and be a supporter and agitate you when we need to, or but that's always the fun of politics, right? Like
I would love
office.
that. Let's do it.
But we really want to be supportive and help make our community the best it can be. So,
yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.
Yeah, you're welcome.